We often find ourselves in one of two tricky places. One, we have absolutely no data, and it's really difficult for us to make informed decisions on how do we improve the work that we're doing. The other place that many of us might be stuck in is we have so much data we don't know what to do with it. In this video, we address the first of those two challenges. We don't have any data, or we don't have the right data, or we don't have enough data. Essentially, the challenge is to figure out how do we go about collecting the data that we need to show the outcome and impact of our very important work in the learning and development world. I hope you found yourself in the right video. Let's jump right in. Hi, I'm Dr. Alaina Szlachta. If you don't know me already, I'm a nerd. I love measurement and evaluation. I love data, and I've been using it my entire career. The focus of these videos is making measurement and evaluation just a little bit easier with some tips, tricks, tools, anything to simplify the process of measurement and evaluation. And in this video, you're going to figure out a few of the different ways to easily collect data and think about, well, if I go this direction, what are the consequences of collecting data with this methodology? And if I go in this direction, what are the consequences of collecting data in this other methodology? There are many, many ways to collect data. And the crazy part is, there's not necessarily a right or wrong approach. There is just the approach that works best for you with your budget, your time, your resources, and your knowledge or expertise, and let's be honest, confidence collecting data. So this video will quickly show you a couple of different buckets of data and methodologies that we can lean into depending on our circumstances. Are you excited? I hope so. Let's get started. So you're probably wondering, what are those two buckets behind me that have been just sitting there teasing you for this entire 30 seconds that I've been on camera? Let me tell you. I want to start by giving you just some basic context about places that we can turn to collect data. The good news is there's only two major types of data, which are represented by these lovely buckets here. To be honest, drawing was never my strong suit, but I'm okay with putting that vulnerability out there. So there are two types of data that we can collect. Bucket number one, and in no particular order, one's not better or worse than the other, they're just different types. Bucket number one is data that we collect, I collect. I have to do the work, or you have to do the work. So done by me. One type of data. Now that's my terminology. It's the simplest terminology. If you were to go into academic research or any type of research journal, you'd probably hear the done by me data form as primary data. Let's just call it PRI for the sake of shortness and handwriting. So we've got our primary data, which most importantly is done by me. And then you probably already guessed this. The second type of data that we can collect is secondary data. Just like the word sounds, it's done by somebody else. Our secondary data set. Also, my handwriting has never won any particular awards either. Perhaps you're in the same bucket as I am, no pun intended. So, why does this matter? Because when we think about simpler solutions to make measurement easier, we want to think about all of the options that are on the table to collect data. And I think in learning and development, and maybe in other industries, oftentimes we think the way to collect data is that we have to do it ourselves, done by me. We have to write a survey. We have to administer the survey. Now that part you definitely have to do. But do we need to create survey tools, rubrics, etc.? Maybe, and maybe not. So what I want to start with is just a quick exploration of secondary data sources, because you might actually be able to save yourself a ton of time by first looking to data that already exists, that's already been collected, and probably with more integrity and following some data collection best practices that might be challenging for you to do on your own. So what are some secondary data sources? They really only fall into 4 to 5 different sub buckets, and I'll write them for you now. Okay, so what we've got are 5 different subgroups of secondary data. And these are all things that exist and in some cases are free. In some cases, you might have to pay a fee to get access to them, but there may be workarounds to that. So here we go, the quick rundown on the 5 different types of data that exist in the world that you might be able to leverage for your collection purposes. So this one is the most interesting. API. What does that mean? It's essentially the thing that allows us to integrate with data on social or internet platforms. So LinkedIn, Instagram, Google, Twitter, and there are many others. They all have an API. In fact, many technology platforms have an API that allow us to integrate with their tool and even the data inside of that tool. So many academic researchers are actually using the API for things like Twitter and LinkedIn to assess data that's being shared on those social platforms for whatever their purposes are. So if that seems relevant to you, that's an option. And in some cases, the API access is actually free. In other cases, it's a low fee, but maybe is accessible. So that might be an option. The next one, and this of course is my personal favorite, is academic research. So if you attended undergraduate or any post-secondary graduate experience, there is this thing called JSTOR, EBSCOhost, and a few others. They are the databases that allow us to find peer-reviewed journal articles that publish data on all kinds of things. I really miss my access to those types of databases. The good news is your public library oftentimes has at least one of those databases, and you can access it remotely with just a library card to be able to get access to some of those academic journal articles. Another source, Google Scholar. Now, a lot of times things on Google Scholar, they're free because they're older, but is a decent starting point. Another source of data, secondary data, is inside of your organization. Your organization and different department leaders are probably collecting tons of different types of data. The challenge, of course, is getting access to it. So in our previous video, I shared with you a hypothesis framework that basically maps out what are you doing and why, and that hypothesis framework can go a long way in getting people bought into giving you access to data inside of your organization. Another source is public health. So the CDC, local government organizations, federal government organizations, community-based organizations, a lot of these nonprofit and government institutions put out data that is under that sort of realm of public health. So if the work you're doing happens to be trying to influence, or you're looking for evidence to help you decide what direction to go in with the program, the public health data might be really beneficial for you. And then lastly, this one is a really fun one that we often overlook, subject matter experts. So you've heard of names like Brene Brown, and there are many others, but she's always my favorite to mention. There are people who have written books, who have done research, who speak at conferences, who have all kinds of data in a really niche area: happiness, emotional intelligence, empathy, vulnerability, communication. There are experts who have probably amazing amounts of data, and even better, they have assessment tools that we might be able to leverage to collect data if we wanted to go on our own and collect data. Don't forget your subject matter experts. They can be a huge source of data, especially in niche areas. So that's the lay of the land on ways that you can get other people's data to help you with your data collection efforts. This is particularly important in 2 areas. One, doing needs assessments, helping you understand problems sort of at the general, whether it's community, geographical, or a certain type of organization. And then the same data can be incredibly useful if you're looking at impact data. So you want to say, how does teaching people certain behavioral skills, what kind of long-term effects does that have? these data sources can often be a huge opportunity that we overlook to tell the story of the longer term impact of the types of programs that we do. Saves you a ton of time and money. And a lot of times this research has been done under certain rigor that makes it have more validity than research or data we might collect on our own. That being said, there are tons of ways that we can collect data on our own. Moving over to the primary source. But what you see here are the sub buckets of ways that we would collect data on our own. Think of these as your methodologies. So we can do interviews, we can survey people, and there's a million different ways to administer and create surveys. And then we can do observations. So sometimes we'll use a combination of these things when we collect data, but those are the main methodologies. And then as creative as you want to be is how then we implement that methodology to collect the data that you need. So now that we've got a lay of the land, albeit a little bit messy, but hopefully the point has come across. Here are the different ways that we can collect data. When it comes to making measurement easier, the very first thing that I would do, look at data other people have collected and see how can we leverage that for our own data collection purposes. And then I would go to data that we would collect on our own to tell the story of the outcomes and change and impact of the work that you're doing. So, as I love case studies, and in our last video, we introduced the case study of a nonprofit organization doing outdoor education, and we talked about the domino effect and a hypothesis framework that helped us to figure out what were the most important metrics to show the immediate, short, and long-term outcomes of their very important work. This video is using the same case study and giving us some practice around how would we collect that data. So I'm going to show you the hypothesis framework one more time, and we're going to practice with just a couple of the metrics, figuring out how do we collect the data. There are three phases of any measurement and evaluation strategy. The why, what are we doing? And why does it matter? And you can see here in this hypothesis image, the map of what this outdoor education program was doing and why it mattered. The second phase is figuring out what are we measuring. And the things that you see highlighted in this image are the most important, those domino metrics that we believed if we just measured these things, we would tell the greatest impact story that would influence some of the other metrics that aren't highlighted in this image. And then lastly, the how. How do we go about measuring the things that we decided were the most important to measure in terms of change and impact from our program? So we tested this out in the community of practice that I host on Mondays. And our group in the live Monday session said they wanted to practice measuring problem solving. They wanted to practice measuring safe choices and collaboration, because those things, well, for one, seemed the most interesting, but also seemed to be the most challenging to potentially measure. So take a minute and just think to yourself, how might we use other people's data to help us understand the aptitude of young people in problem solving, and then be able to use that same data after the program is over? What comes to mind for you? So here's what we came up with in our live community of practice. And it's, on the one hand, a great opportunity, but it might have some challenges, which may lead us to not use it after all, but it's a great place to start to try. So in our particular case study, this outdoor education program is being administered, if you will, or done with youth. So if you think about problem solving, who has data about young people's ability to solve problems? Schools, teachers, and parents. So parents probably don't have any data. We could maybe interview them, but that would be going to a primary source of data, which we want to see if we can leverage a secondary source first, because it has a little bit more integrity and it's a lot less work. So if parents can't be a source of data on problem solving in a secondary way, well, what about teachers in schools? Well, that's an interesting concept. So in some schools, they are already assessing children's problem solving abilities. So what I would do is I would first go to the schools and I would ask them if they happen to be collecting data on youth's ability to solve problems. What kinds of assessment tools are they already administering? And might they give us access to that data so that we can show how youth in those outdoor education programs are able to improve their problem solving skills using data the schools are already collecting? That would be my first attempt at data collection. Now, of course, every way in which we collect data has both positives and negatives. There are consequences, good and bad. Maybe the schools collect that data, but not all students have access to it. Maybe some youth are homeschooled. Maybe some youth go to public schools and some go to private schools. And so the data you have access to isn't equal. And if that's a big problem because you want to have as much data to collect on as many of the participants in your program, then maybe that's not a viable solution. But if all of the youth are coming from one school and that school happens to collect data on youth's ability to solve problems, this would be a huge opportunity to leverage a secondary data set to show a baseline capability of problem solving using that same data to collect it after the program. And then maybe sometime after the program is over, we look at that data one more time. And what's great about that is we can compare the youth who attended the program and the youth who did not attend the program to see if there are any significant differences, which we would hope that there would be, right? So that would be my first suggestion of evaluating problem-solving skills, is looking to schools' data where they already collect that information. Now, here are a few other options, because again, how we collect data, there's not one right or wrong way. It is what makes the most sense for what it is that you are doing. So if for some reason we can't lean into school data, there are other options. What do you think those might be? Here are a few others to consider. So what if there is a tool that a subject matter expert has created for young people to evaluate their problem solving skills? Now, that data probably isn't going to give us exact information about this group, but it could be really interesting data to use for some of the longer term impact. These subject matter experts will often say, here are some of the problems contributing to the inability of young people to solve problems. And that might be a really interesting data set to lean on to tell the longer term impact. If I were to collect the data on my own, going to the primary source of data, I might leverage, if it exists, a tool that somebody else has created to evaluate problem solving skills in youth. This is something that we don't have to create, and making measurement easier would be finding a tool that works for your situation that's already been validated, usually in academic settings or just in the number of times that particular tool has been utilized. So the limitations to adopting a tool is, well, sometimes they're expensive, and maybe we don't have a budget to buy the tool and administer it. That's a valid concern. If we don't have the time, if we don't have the money to adopt an external tool, and we don't have access to a secondary data set to help us get data on youth's problem-solving capabilities, well, then what else do? We could create our own rubric using observation. So observation is arguably one of the greatest forms of evaluation. What's the consequence of using observation? It's super time consuming, and that also has a cost associated with it. But in some cases, it's the best opportunity to figure out what kind of capabilities do youth have in problem solving. So a fun way that the group in our live community of practice came up with was, what if we gave youth an activity as sort of an icebreaker in the education program, and then we had camp counselors or adult supervisors, maybe even parents if that's appropriate, we had them observing youth, and we had them scoring groups or individuals in certain behaviors and the frequency of those behaviors or the quality of certain behaviors that would suggest capabilities of problem solving. So that's a really cool option. The consequence of that is we have to create a micro level behavior sort of rubric that says, here's what behaviors we would want to see and to what degree they may be present. That might be something that's really time consuming or feels uncomfortable. We don't want any kind of assessment to be subjective. And with observation, we wanted to try to remove subjectivity as much as possible, such that we can get good quality data that we can really have faith and that it tells us the right information about youth's capabilities. So that would be our third option. Now, here's one more that's really interesting. So all the options we've talked about so far for evaluating problem solving, they're all using quantitative data, so numbers. The analysis would be some sort of numerical outcome that evaluates young people and their problem-solving capabilities. There is another way, using qualitative data, and that would be interviews. So you could also do this in a survey form, but I would definitely recommend interviews. So imagine you're interviewing teachers and parents and asking for each particular youth, asking them to reflect on a time when their young person had to solve a problem. What was that like? What did they do well? What got in the way of their ability to solve problems? Imagine we had one interview protocol and it had 3 questions. Tell us about a time when Susie was dealing with a situation that was problematic. How did she solve the problem? Question number 1. What did she do well? Question number 2. What did she not do so great? Question number 3. That qualitative information, that story format, can then be analyzed for themes. The themes of that can then be categorized, and we could look to see about the frequency of certain themes for certain youth. And then if we use the same story format after the program is over, we can see if there's any change. Are there more positive qualities? Are the negative qualities that originated before the program, did those go away? Were they replaced by some other positive qualities? So we can use an interview and a qualitative approach to collecting data on the capabilities of young people in problem solving. So that's a lot, and also really exciting because, again, there are a multitude of ways you can collect data just to solve for one metric. And in this case, it was problem solving. Each one of these options has its own positive and negative, whether it's cost, time consuming, which is also costly, or maybe inaccessible. So we just have to figure out what works the best for our scenario. And the most important thing you can do is to think through this map. First, what's the secondary data source I might be able to leverage? And then next, of the primary data, if I'm going to take ownership of collecting it, how do I do that in the way that has the most integrity, that also isn't going to be so labor and time intensive or costly, depending on the resources you have access to? So that's how I think about how we collect data. So that is all for now. Talking about data collection can feel nuanced and complicated, and let me tell you, all you have to do is just start somewhere. But going through this process of leveraging secondary data, what sources might I be able to access? And then if I have to collect data myself, what are the ways that I can do that? And figuring out what's the best fit for my scenario. Going through that thinking process and all the times you have to collect data, it will get easier the more you do it. And if you're someone like me who really enjoys the process of working with data, this gets really, really fun the more that you do it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you've taken away some new ideas and some new tools you can apply. And as always, we host a weekly community of practice. If you're looking for an amazing group of thought leaders, of learning leaders, and just practitioners who want to grow and connect with others, our community is a really wonderful place. You'll probably enjoy yourself there. So I hope you'll tune into our next video, and maybe we'll see you in our community of practice. The details about that community are all down below in the description of this video. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.